Michael is the Manager of Marine and Coastal Sciences and Programs at Parks Victoria. Prior to joining Parks, Michael spent oodles of time in Port Phillip Bay getting to know marine sessile communities. If you want to know about sponges, bryozoans, ascidians, Michael is your man. I don't know if that knowledge is still there, but I think it would be one of those things that it would come back to him if he was put in front of a settlement plate. He also learnt a lot about tropical rainforest plants while participating in a study that ran, and I use the word ran, 1,500 kilometre transect. So any of you have done any science, you know, basically everything's done with a 50-metre tape measure. This was just a little bit bigger along the east coast of Australia. So he's actually moved from the sea to the trees, basically. He's also got really good knowledge about tropical rainforest plants as well. So again, gives you a good idea of how diverse our speakers are tonight. He's also spent some time hooning around the bay in boats while working for the EPA. And he's been in his current role for 18 months and was gifted with the task of wading through over 20 years of research done in Victoria's marine national parks and sanctuaries. And tonight he's going to do his best to condense that into about 10 or 15 minutes. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Sams. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for the introduction, Kate. Yes, bryozoans and sponges aren't things you forget. I'm a bit rusty, but they're still pretty burnt onto my brain. Yeah, look, thanks for joining me, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Kate. Yeah, to begin with, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the first peoples on the lands we're meeting today. So I'm beaming to you from Wurundjeri country, very wet Wurundjeri country right now. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and future. So as Kate said, I just want to talk to you about some of the monitoring and research that we've been doing at Parks Victoria over the past 20 years we've had with marine parks. And before I get into that, I should say that most of this research has been done with research partners at Deakin University, Melbourne University, and universities across the state. So I won't be able to acknowledge them through the talk, but just keep that in mind. Before I get into that, though, I just want to take a step back and talk about Victoria's marine national parks and sanctuaries. So around 20 years ago, Victoria created a network of highly protected no-take marine national parks and sanctuaries. And so the purpose of these was specifically to protect representative examples of Victoria's marine biodiversity and the ecological processes that support that biodiversity for future generations of Victorians. So many of you will be familiar with it, but this is our network here. So as our system of marine protected areas spans the entire state from Cape Howe in the far east to Discovery Bay in the west, and then it extends into each of our major bays, Port Phillip Bay, Western Port, and Corner Inlet, which I don't know if you can see on my mouse, but you'll all be familiar with that. On this map, what you can see are the dark blue areas of the marine national parks and sanctuaries, and these are our strictly no-take marine reserves that were specifically set up for the protection of biodiversity. And then there's these lighter blue areas like at Corner Inlet, just above the prom there, which are our multi-use areas. So again, they were still set up to protect biodiversity, but also to allow for multiple uses like recreational fishing and commercial fishing and things like that. So our monitoring and research has really focused on understanding whether Victoria's marine protected areas have been meeting that purpose they are created for, which is to protect representative biodiversity. And so to understand this, over the past 20 years, there are probably three broad questions that we focused on. And so the first of these has really just been to understand what is actually in our marine protected areas. So when the parks were created, they weren't done with the best available information and habitat mapping, but this was fairly limited. So as managers, we need to understand what's in our parks and where it is to manage it effectively. And so we've undertaken a lot of habitat mapping to understand what's in there, and as well as biological surveys to get a handle on what they are. So the next major aspect that we're seeking to understand is what the condition of the biodiversity is within our marine protected areas. So to do this, we look at the long-term trends of what's inside our park and compare this to what's outside as well. And so that gives us a good handle on the effects of protection and how things are tracking over time. And finally, we also undertake quite a bit of research to understand whether the things that we're managing are being done effectively and if it's making a difference towards protecting biodiversity. So obviously, that's a lot for me to talk about in 10 minutes, and I'm not going to, so don't panic, Cade. So what I want to talk about today is really focus on what's the condition of things in our marine protected areas, what are the long-term trends in abundance, and you know, looking at those inside-out comparisons, and you know, how have the parks performed effectively over the past 20 years. So the main way that we've got this information has been through diver monitoring in our marine protected areas. So we've been really fortunate in that the Victorian government had the foresight to establish diver monitoring surveys before the parks were even created. So these approaches have been slightly modified over the past 20 years, but effectively we've had continuous monitoring of our marine protected areas, as well as some reference sites outside of our MPAs as far back as 1998. So this means we have a really good time series to examine the trends in the key species that we're interested in, which is great. So over the years, now hopefully this will play. Give me a thumbs up if it's playing, Cade. Over the years, what we've also done, great, is added new approaches to complement the diver survey. So this footage here is from a technique known as a baited remote underwater video, which some of you may be familiar with. It's basically a camera on legs that we drop on the seafloor with some sardines at the end of this orange pole that you can see sticking out. Fish come along and swim up to it, and we can count the fish, identify what they are. And what we do is we drop these in different habitats inside and outside our parks, and it gives us a sense of what types of fish are using the different habitats, whether that protection is working, what are the differences inside and outside. And we also get really amazing footage from it. Like this is a classic example we got from Cape Howe, this grey nurse shark that we found up at Cape Howe Marine National Park, which we hadn't seen before. Some of the abalone fishes up there have probably seen them more commonly. But yeah, the other thing that we've also been doing is adding some kind of more specialised monitoring to our monitoring programs. So recently with Deakin Uni, we've been undertaking surveys of southern rock lobster, both inside and outside of the MPAs, to understand whether they're being adequately protected. So we've chosen to focus on this species because it's ecologically a really important species. It's a keystone predator on urchins, things that graze on kelp that we want to have there. So really important for reef health. It's also a target of illegal fishing. So it provides that really great indicator that bridges the gap of being ecologically important, needing protection from the parks, and can tell us a lot about the health of our parks and whether things are being effectively protected. So as I said, we're now coming up on 20 years of our marine national parks and sanctuary, and that's meant that we in our team will be thinking a lot about how they've performed over this past 20 years. So next, I'm just going to show you a few key stories from our monitoring programs that tell us something about what our parks have been doing and how species have been tracking in them. There's obviously tons more stories than what I can show you here, so I'll throw in some resources at the end, but these, I guess, are the key ones that I think are the main interesting stories. So one of the simplest ways we can measure biodiversity is through a measure called species richness, which I'm sure many of you here are familiar with, and that's just the number of distinct species that you find in the area that you measure. So what we've recently done is completed a statewide assessment of our whole marine national park and sanctuary network. So basically grouped everything we've measured in together and then compared differences inside and outside of our parks. And what we found was a really nice pattern, which is basically that inside our marine protected areas, we have high richness of fish and also of the large mobile macroinvertebrates we measure. So things like sea stars, abalone, what else do we get? Large mollusks. Those are the types of things we're measuring. Feather stars, brittle stars, things like that. And so that high richness is a really good indication that that high level of protection that we give these areas for our marine protected areas is working and having benefit to biodiversity in those areas. Similarly, when we kind of zoomed in and we've looked at southern rock lobster, we found some really great patterns there that show how marine protected areas benefit a species like this. So we've completed these surveys now at Cape Howe, Port Phillip Heads, Wilson's Prom and Point Addis. And at Point Addis, Port Phillip Heads and Wilson's Prom, we found a pretty consistent pattern. The numbers differ between them, but fairly consistent pattern where we get more individuals inside our marine protected areas, and they all tend to be larger and often it's significantly more individuals inside. And so this to me is a really nice example of how our marine parks are working and effectively protecting these species, but also some of the benefits of marine protected areas. So something like a southern rock lobster, when it reproduces, it produces little babies, larvae that last for about up to 2 years in the water when they disperse. So that means that some of the larvae from these populations we're protecting in our parks have the potential to effectively disperse from one end of the state to the other. So creating these really important source populations that can then spill over out and replenish reefs outside the parks. So not what the parks were originally intended for when they were designed, but a really significant benefit of having that protection. And so then we've also looked at some of the long-term trends of fish species to compare how they're tracking. And there are some really nice examples. So the blue throat wrasse is a really great example of a species that shows a lot of benefit from marine national parks. I'm sure most of you here, if not everyone, knows this species quite well. One of the most common and widespread reef fish in Victoria. So it's a great one to track. The plots here show the number of blue throat wrasse inside the Marine National Park, which is the black line, and outside, which is the grey line. This is what we call an ecological control chart, and the colours here correspond to abundances that are good. Yellow is like not so good, and red is what we kind of use as a trigger that there's some management that is required. And so at Point Addis and Port Phillip Heads, we got this pretty strong trend of high numbers inside the park, as well as this really nice increasing trend since the parks were created over time. So a great indication that things are tracking well for that species inside our parks. In the interest of transparency, this isn't the case everywhere. At Wilson's Prom, we don't see those strong differences inside and outside of the park. And in some cases, there has been more outside. But in somewhere like Wilson's Prom, this is an area it's a bit more remote. There's less pressure from recreational fishing, and there's good habitat both inside of the outside of the park. So we kind of expect those patterns to be a little bit weaker. But in general, we can see that there's some parks that are having real benefit for this species. And that's also true for a range of other species. So we found this for things like the yellow striped leatherjacket here, the horseshoe leatherjacket, that have those generally higher abundances inside our marine parks. Similarly for things like the scaly fin at Point Addis Marine National Park and the sea sweep. So these are fish that they're all kind of reef attached fish, maybe less so the sea sweep, but they're all pretty reef attached, but they have quite different life histories and feeding modes and things like that. And so across them, we're seeing these kind of patterns of higher numbers inside our parks. And again, not everywhere. At Port Phillip Heads, see the scaly fin doesn't seem fussed whether it's in a park or out of the park, but at Point Addis it does. They do demonstrate, though, that a number of our parks are fulfilling that purpose of protecting a range of fish species quite well. And it's not just restricted to fish. So we've seen similar patterns to what I've described for the green lip abalone at Port Phillip Heads. So again, this is a really ecologically important invertebrate species. And, it's a nice one, again, like the southern rock lobster, that its larvae can disperse outside the park. And so it can replenish those populations outside. But I guess, what was my point here? My point here is not restricted to fish. We're seeing this for large macroinvertebrates like this as well. However, it's not the case for everything that we've been measuring. So in contrast to the species I've just described, we are seeing some declines and signs of trouble for some species. A major example of this is the black lip abalone. So what we have seen in general is a strong long-term decline in this species across the western and central parts of the state where our parks are. We still have often seen high numbers inside our parks. And what we see is that this decline is occurring both inside and outside our parks. So it suggests that this is representing a larger decline than just what's happening inside our parks. And certainly that's been backed up, I guess, by other research that's out there. However, not the case at Cape Howe in the Far East, for example, where things are bouncing up and down. So it's not all doom and gloom everywhere. So it's a complex story, and that's one we're still trying to unpack and understand from our monitoring. And I guess for me, one of the biggest stories that's happening out there and one of the more concerning patterns that we are seeing has been a general decline in large canopy forming brown algal species across the state. From our monitoring that we've recently completed at Point Addis, Port Phillip Heads and Wilson's Prom, where we've looked at these long 20-year time series, we've basically seen a fairly long-term decline that I guess varies in significance depending on which park you're looking at. It is a complex story, but at Point Addis, it's virtually disappeared from our plots there. At Point Addis, it went through a decline recently and just bouncing back. Sorry, at Port Phillip Heads, and at the Prom again, we've seen that decline. And we followed up on this. This is showing a Colonia radiata, the golden kelp here. But we've also seen this to some extent for Philospora comosa, the crayweed, and these are the two major canopy forming species in Victoria. But Philospora is tracking a little better. But we've also recently used this monitoring and followed up on it with some larger research projects that we've done with Deakin University that are showing that is kind of a statewide trend of decline in certain areas of the state from east to west. And again, not happening everywhere. There are some areas where it's pretty stable and it's pretty okay, but decline is generally the story across the state. In some cases, we know what the cause of this is. It's because urchins have become overabundant and are eating away the cover of this kelp. But in the western parts of the state, we're still seeing this decline. And some recent work we've done is suggesting that this is linked to increases in sea surface temperature that we're seeing in southern Australia. So we're currently working on this and working out how to respond, restore, and kind of conserve kelp in our marine protected areas. Yeah, so those are really the key stories from me. So thanks very much for listening. There's tons more information out there that we're providing. Here are some links, and I think I've sent you these links, Kate, if you're able to pop them in the chat, because I might be able to. So to celebrate our 20th anniversary, we've got a website here. We've developed a webinar series, and on that website, I recently gave a more extended webinar on Victoria's marine biodiversity, and I borrowed quite a few slides of that for this talk. So sorry if you saw that as well, and I've doubled up. But and also more details and the comprehensive kind of findings of these monitoring programs we've been running can be found in the Parks Victoria Technical Series, which is a publication that we put out that puts all our data out there and details what we're finding with our monitoring, and that's located here at this website. So thank you very much, everyone. That's it from me.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. It's really hard when you don't get that applause sort of thing to know that you've actually finished. So that was great. Thank you. There was just one thing I wanted to ask you, Mike, which is in relation to all this research. Are you seeing any large-scale changes in the environment? Like what sort of large-scale changes are you seeing regardless of parks? Like you mentioned a couple there with the algae and what have you, but I guess we're sort of leaning towards like the climate change, and there's these sort of larger impacts that, irregardless of the park itself, it's something that's occurring along our coastline. Is there any sort of indicators or anything that's showing up with that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, look, so there's probably three things that jump to mind. One of them I've just spoken about, which is the decline in kelp. The second one, which is related to that, is we're seeing this explosion of urchins, which I'm sure many of you out there diving have noticed. In northern Port Phillip Bay, the bay's basically been eaten away by the purple urchin, and on the east coast, you've got Centra stephanus, which is coming in. We're starting to think that the purple urchin increase is linked to warmer sea surface temperatures, which has that climate change aspect to it, and we know that Centra stephanus is coming in from the east where its native range is and extending into Victoria because the East Australia current is pushing in under climate change. And southeastern Australia is a hotspot for ocean warming. It's one of the hotspots because of that extension of the East Australia current, and what we're starting to see up there is some species that we expect to be there, but they tend to have that more central and western distribution in Victoria. Things like your horseshoe leather jackets, and we're just not seeing as commonly anymore. We just did the survey at Cape Howe, and some of those species we haven't seen since 2015. So we think what we're starting to see is things shifting their range that have that more preference and tolerance for colder water environments. They're starting to shift away. And I guess that's something that's front of mind for us at Parks Victoria, is thinking about, what are these changes that are driven by climate, particularly around species range shifts? How can we manage that? How can we make our parks good habitat for those type of species? And then what's the stuff that we just accept is change that's beyond our ability to manage in the small kind of parcels of water and seafloor that we have? So yeah, it's definitely changes happening rapidly, I think.
Yeah, and that was a tough question to answer. You did a good job with that. We've got a couple of questions here. As I said, we might finish Mike's talk at 8, so that anyone who needs to go, feel free to go, and we will send you around a link to Nicole's. But please, if you need to refresh yourself, go and do that. We'll kick off Nicole's talk at 8. We've got a couple of talks here. So we've got one from Dave asking, great presentation, Mike. Are there any obvious changes in results of effort that could be attributed to the move from dedicated scientific research efforts to the citizen science surveys or the reef life surveys? Was there sort of a comparison done between the two methods to ensure that the samples are coming back the same?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good question. I think I get it properly, but I guess, so a good example of what you're talking about is at Parks Victoria, we have moved, and Cade, maybe you were talking about this, I don't know, when I was trying to get my modem turned on, but we moved from a program that we kind of ran, the subtidal reef monitoring program, and now we switched to reef life servers. So we have lots of rangers at Parks Victoria who are trained in reef life survey. We can also pick up additional data from the citizen science. And what we have done is kind of, what's the word I'm trying to say it in a simple way, but harmonized that data with the reef life survey data. And it's great. I mean, the reef life survey data that we get is fantastic. It's as good as what we were doing in the past, and that's helped us to kind of keep that time series going, because to be honest, cost is an issue for us, and with monitoring programs aren't cheap. And so having that big community that's kind of nationally, it builds more support, it helps sustain the science. You know, it's kind of like the more people get hooked on citizen science and things like reef life survey, the greater the likelihood is that that thing will be sustained over a long time. The data's good, we can use it, so we're using it in our monitoring programs. And that goes for things like the Great Victorian Fish Count, like the intelligence and the things we get from that are great. So I'll shut up in a sec, Kate, because I'm going to wrap it on. But just to give you one nice example of some of the work that's come out of this group is, you know, there's been some questions going around about weedy sea dragon distributions around certain areas of Victoria, and there hasn't been a lot of concerted monitoring effort by us and by other, you know, scientists around weedy sea dragon distributions. And so some of the stuff that's come out through the Great Victorian Fish Count, just to show where they are, how widespread they are, where people are picking up, has been really valuable just to know, you know, this is where it is. It doesn't have a restricted distribution or whatever we're trying to find out. So, and what habitats it's found in. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess in a nutshell, since science is very valuable. And
you got to thanks
great,
Michael.
yeah.
So I have a feeling in there somewhere that was the answer that he was looking
the answer
for, and the
yeah.
response. Yeah, and it is a tough one. And so here, look, from one curly question to another, and I think this unfortunately is your role as someone who works for state government, is that people like to throw curly questions at you. Like the lecturers from universities are fine. Let's ask them the nice, easy questions. But let's get stuck into parks with the curly ones. And you mentioned continuous monitoring, but from my time at PV, it seemed sporadic and irregular. What was the actual frequency? And I guess you can have sites around the state. So is there a regular monitoring, or is it one of those things that, you know, there's obviously been funding gaps and time gaps and different things that are happening, so you're doing the best you can, and the fact that you have 20 years, it helps sort of, I guess it's not so much patch over, but it helps you paint a better picture, because while you may not be monitoring every year, you do have that time series that is often not afforded to anything really.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting comment. Like, I think that so there have been gaps in it where things haven't been done, but I kind of wonder if that perception hasn't come from the fact that we haven't actually promoted and got out there all the work that we've been doing. Because, you know, really from about 2002 to 2011, there was a lot of monitoring that was done for the subtidal reef monitoring program across heaps of most of our marine national parks, and it was, you know, not annual, but it was close to annual for most of them. Then there was a bit of a sort of slowdown around 2014, and then we picked up reef life survey methods. And so, you know, places like Cape Howe, there has been a few years gap. So, you know, we haven't got it every single year, but we certainly got that, you know, lots of data points across the 20 years, you know, and more than 10, 15 years of data points from that diver monitoring. And then some of the stuff I've talked about, the Bruv and the rock lobster, is stuff that we've only just started, but we've sustained that since about 2016 when all that stuff kicked off. And it could appear a bit sporadic as well, Kay, because I'll just say our model that we use for monitoring, because these campaigns that we're doing now are quite intensive and not overly cheap, what we do is we focus on one park in one of the marine bioregions. On 1 year, we do a big campaign that year, and then we move to another one. So we're kind of rotating around the state every 3 years. So, you know, it's yeah. I mean, we could always do more monitoring. There's no doubt about that. But, you know,
I know, and that's, I mean, you have the expertise and the skills in that sort of analysis of data and knowing where your gaps are. So the conclusions you're making are based on knowing what those limitations are. So,
absolutely.
I appreciate you taking the time.